Hey, what's going on, guys? So, I see this argument brought up every week in my live streams and on Twitter and Reddit every so often. This idea that Peter Parker should grow up and have a stable job, get married, and have children. And this is a sentiment that I often pragmatically argue with because I know for a fact that Marvel is not going to allow that to happen, or at the very least, not allow it to happen anytime soon. And if they do, they won't allow it to happen organically, or it'll be done in an alternate universe what if title or something like that. But in all honesty, despite accepting this reality, I do wish that Marvel would allow Peter Parker to grow up, have a family, pass off the mantle of Spider-Man, and eventually die. Because I think that that will be in keeping with the philosophy of the character, as well as the Marvel Universe as a whole. Now, I know that I often dismissively say that there isn't much of a difference between the Marvel and DC universes and that cape shit is cape shit no matter what, but that's not actually how I feel. That's just what I say to people who unironically play the I'm a Marvel, I'm a DC, like,
Oh! Ew! Dude! What the fuck?
I'm sorry, that shit is just the definition of cringe to me. Like, bro, fuck off. Be that as it may, I do see a core fundamental difference between the Marvel and DC universes. That being, the DC universe is mythology. It's a pantheon. That universe and those characters are flexible and vague in the same way that Greek mythology, or Norse mythology, or Egyptian mythology, or the various Native American mythologies, or American tall tales, or fairy tales, if you will, are all very flexible and loose. How many takes on Hercules are there? How different are each of them? How many times have we seen Dracula? And how different is the character in each of those interpretations? How different is the lore in each of those interpretations? Right? I feel the same rules apply for DC Comics. And that's something that I've talked about at length. It's the reason why I think that you can put Henry Cavill's Superman next to Christopher Reeve's Superman, next to George Reeves' Superman, next to Tyler Hoechlin's Superman, and they're all equally valid takes on the character, because Superman, much like Dracula or Hercules, is a myth. There's going to be thousands of Superman stories across all forms of media that contradict each other thematically, or run over the same subject matter but change things here or there, or just straight up do the thing but do it in such a radically different manner it changes the nature of the character on a fundamental level. But again, that works for DC characters because they're archetypal. Not so much with Marvel characters, and by extension, not so much with Spider-Man. Because the Marvel universe, unlike the DC universe, is not a pantheon, but a soap opera. The Marvel Universe is built on this idea of being a one-for-one reflection of the real world, except it has superheroes in it. And much like the real world, characters were set to evolve. They would grow and change, sometimes for the better, sometimes for worse. And sometimes they would refuse to change, which would present challenges in their own right. But that's the thing. With the Marvel Universe being a reflection of the real world, much like the real world, the characters in it would age and progress with time. And Peter Parker is a clear example of this. Now, granted, a lot of people, well, really a lot of Marvel fans, often try to nail down specific dates and find formulas to map out the various ages of Marvel characters in the Marvel Universe, largely because Marvel itself took strides to flesh out their universe with countless guidebook magazines and Who's Who special issues and stuff like that. But if you go back and try to track some of that stuff, as the years go by, Marvel starts to play really fast and loose with their continuity and their sliding timescale. And there's even a retcon, I believe, from Mark Waid, or maybe it's JMS, I don't quite remember which, but there's a retcon which explains why Marvel has developed certain glaring continuity, not errors, but more like inconsistencies. where it was revealed that Franklin Richards is actually keeping everybody from aging because he likes being a kid, and he wants everybody in the Marvel Universe to be, as he sees it, their ideal age. Because Franklin Richards, in this case, is a stand-in for Marvel Comics fans. Or at the very least, a stand-in for how Marvel Comics thinks Marvel fans see the Marvel Universe. That said, a lot of these characters still manage to progress and grow and change. And in the case of Peter Parker, if you pay attention to the character's history and continuity within the primary 616 continuity, which wouldn't really be all that difficult because Marvel wasn't nearly as alternate universe happy as they've been for the past 20 or so years, you can track a clear progression of Peter Parker's character from high school well into adulthood. Again, it's nearly impossible to find a solid equation to map Peter's exact age, but, I mean, you have a pretty solid idea of how old he's supposed to be based on the events unfolding in his life. And also, with that, you see how Peter changes over time. In the original Lee and Ditko era, Peter is a bitter, angry, lonely incel. He has a real bone to pick with society, but he's also angry with himself for not living up to social norms based on his own interest and hobbies. And that's further exacerbated once he becomes Spider-Man, because on top of worrying about school and girls and all of the usual pleasantries that go along with being a teenager, he's also wrestling with this massive guilt because he blames himself for the death of Uncle Ben. Because now that Uncle Ben is gone, the breadwinner of the house is gone. Aunt May's lost her husband of God knows how many centuries. And he's running around as a superhero, but everybody hates him. So he's a social outcast as both Peter Parker and Spider-Man. And it's just a whole mess. Peter's life is a whole mess. But then we get into the Romita Sr. era. And this is Peter's college years. And now, Pete's starting to take himself a little less seriously. And as a result, he's attracting more female company. And suddenly, it's the Archie Andrews problem, Oh, who do I choose? Golly gee, is it Gwen Stacy or Mary Jane Watson? Oh, all these problems in my head. Oh, boobies. But then we see the character progress even further, and this is the Gil Kane, Jerry Conway era, where most of Peter's friends from high school and college are starting to make important life decisions. Flash Thompson joins the army. Pete's first on-again, off-again girlfriend, Betty Brant, gets married to Ned Leeds. And his roommate, Harry Osborn, Harry becomes addicted to drugs, and he's in real bad shape because he has all of these insecurities about living up to his father's expectations. And then both Gwen Stacy as well as her father suffer horrific Spider-Man-related deaths. And then Harry's father, the Green Goblin, also dies. And then Peter and MJ get together, kind of. And then they break up because MJ's like, "Oh no, Daddy, I'm a Sagittarius with major air sign energy. I'm not supposed to be held down." So that relationship doesn't work out. And then we see Peter bounce around between other girlfriends and other relationships, while also battling new crime syndicates and supervillains, which were all pretty flash in the pan and didn't really last throughout the 70s. And then he later graduates college, and then he becomes a teaching assistant, and then he winds up dating Black Cat, which was also a relationship that didn't last. And then now, he's in a new stage of his life, and then MJ comes back, and then they get married, and then a bunch of other crazy shit happens around Peter and MJ's marriage, because MJ's father goes to jail, and Ned Leeds is murdered horrifically, and then Kraven's Last Hunt happens, and then there's Venom, and the Hobgoblin, and the reformation of the Sinister Six, and clones, and then we find out that Norman Osborn was never actually dead in the first place. And then Peter and MJ suffer a miscarriage, and then MJ dies in a plane crash, but not really. And then we get to the 2000s, when JMS, John Romita Jr., Mark Millar, and Terry and Rachel Dodson squarely, definitively establish Peter as being a late 20s, early 30s something. And now, he's a science teacher at his old high school. And just in that 40-year-ish time span from 1962 into 2002, we watch Peter Parker go through a substantial evolution of character. and we watch him hit all of the major hallmarks that one usually hits when growing up. I think Godzilla Mendoza said it best in one of his MCU Spider-Man videos, where he said something to the effect of, Spider-Man isn't the story of a boy being a superhero. It's the story of a boy becoming a man because he's a superhero. And, well, Peter is a man now. He has been for quite a while. And you can tell that Marvel doesn't quite know what to do with the character as a result, because they keep trying to regress him back to previous status quos, be it professionally or romantically. And it really feels like Peter's reluctance to grow up is also tied to Marvel's reluctance to allow Peter to move on from being Spider-Man. Because that's where the journey ends, right? All of those feelings of powerlessness and anger and resentment and guilt. Nobody holds on to all of that from their childhood. Or at the very least, very few sane, rational people do. And in the case of Peter Parker, with all of the life lessons he's learned along the way, the conclusion of his journey as Spider-Man isn't some grand, epic death, the same as it would be for a character like Batman, or The Flash, or Wolverine, or Daredevil. It would be accepting that he's atoned for the death of Uncle Ben 1,000 times over. It would be settling down and having a wife and children, and then letting Spider-Man, as a fixture in his life, go. And allowing some other poor kid who's trying to figure everything out to use Spider-Man as a tool to help them navigate the path to adulthood in the same way Peter did. Now, ideally, that's what I would want to see, because this is exactly what the Marvel Universe was built on. Characters going through life, learning lessons, passing down legacies with great irreverence, because they themselves are growing and changing, and therefore don't see the status quo of the mantle that they've left behind as something regal or legendary, but much rather a symbol of a particular phase in their life that they've simply outgrown. Now again, realistically, I know that this would never happen, at least when it comes to Spider-Man in the main 616 continuity. That's why, for all of its problems, I still have a deep appreciation for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Because all of those characters do grow, and they do get a chance to change. And because actors are mortal, and contracts don't last forever, some of these characters are allowed to have a resolution. And it's in keeping with the philosophy that attracted me to Marvel Comics in the first place. That it's the world outside your window. And much like the world, people change. Because change is constant. Change is life. And living is being in a state of motion. Constantly evolving, constantly growing, constantly transforming. And Spider-Man hasn't really been that for a long time. It feels like for the past 15 or so years, Peter has been standing still, stagnant, meandering in this living death, where he's forever an early 30-something, living life as an early 20-something. And I think it's high time Marvel Comics moved Peter into the next stage of his life. And for Spider-Man to evolve into an institution that means something different for Peter. But what about you? What do you think about this idea that Marvel characters, Spider-Man in particular, should be allowed to grow and change, and maybe pass on their mantle down to other people? But again, Spider-Man in particular, what do you think about him settling down and leaving Spider-Man behind? Let me know down below in the comment section. Also, if you like this video, hit the like button, share, support the channel, and if you want to see more content like this, all you have to do is subscribe. I am the Mystical Green Beanie. Thank you for watching, and as always, until next time, adios nachos, adios.
Charged up.